All right, we're going to start. So thank you everyone for joining us. There's quite a few of you online, so we appreciate you taking the time on a Sunday evening to join. I want to start by thanking everyone for coming, and for those who are coming to an NIF event for the first time, I wanted to give you a brief hello as to what we are. So NIF was founded more than 35 years ago as a partnership between diaspora Jews and Israelis, as a way of supporting a burgeoning social justice and human rights movement in Israel. And since then, as that partnership, NIF has been able to pursue the values of the Declaration of Independence, of equality and justice and democracy for all, and in those 35 years has distributed more than $200 million to support civil society in Israel, particularly in the areas of democracy, equality, justice, for Palestinian Israelis, for asylum seekers and refugees, on women's issues, and on economic and social issues as well. I want to start very quickly with an introduction to Bernard and also an intro into the format for tonight. But before I do, what I wanted to just quickly recognize was the passing earlier this week of David Landau. David was an incredible journalist and a former editor of Haaretz, both the Hebrew and the founder of the English edition. David was a visitor to our shores as a guest of NIF Australia in 2011, and was certainly integral in our founding and in our narrative since then. And the world is certainly poorer for losing him, and he was a really wonderful gentleman. And so we send our best wishes to Jackie and his family in Jerusalem. I wanted to I'll give just a brief intro into Bernard in a second. The format we're going to take tonight, Bernard will give a brief discussion of some of the issues as he sees them. And he will also then take a question and answer. The easiest way to ask your questions, as a couple of you have already done, is the Q&A button on the top of your screen. You can just type in your question and we'll hopefully get to as many of them live as we can. And if not, I'm sure more questions and answers will come up as we go on. So a brief introduction to Bernard. We're very lucky that he's been able to join us. You came to Australia a number of years ago and did a number of events for NIF in Melbourne and Sydney, which we continue to be very grateful for. And certainly we've had wonderful feedback so far from people who've heard that you've been able to join us again. So we're very grateful. Bernard teaches political economy at Dartmouth College and business planning at Hebrew University. He's a prolific author and academic on issues particularly relating to Israel's Jewish and democratic character. He's the author of The Tragedy of Zionism, A New Israel, and the Hebrew Republic. And he writes regularly for the New Yorker Online, Harper's, and The Nation. Most recently, he also had an op-ed in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago about the Charlie Hebdo and the massacre of French Jews after that. So I think with that, I'll say thank you again to Bernard for joining us, and thank you everyone online for joining us. And I'll let you take it away, Bernard.
Thank you very much, Liam. Thank you for inviting me. I did enjoy Australia tremendously, and would love to see friends there again. I am going to try to do justice to the specific title that I was asked of the talk that I was asked to speak on. But obviously, I'm going to wander away from it a little bit too. Specifically, does the two-state solution still have legs? I want to start by saying, in some way, the two-state solution is inevitable. There's no possible way of ever solving our problems with the Palestinians without acknowledging that there are two distinct national groups living in a small space, and that these two distinct national groups are going to have to find a way to allow for sovereignty and the means for self-expression for both. There's no possible way of wishing that problem away. We're never going to have a single state in which everybody speaks a nice accented English, sort of the way, I speak with Khalil Shikaki when I visited him in Ramallah a couple of days days ago. I mean, yes, he and I could probably create a one-state reality, but the truth is, he is no more indicative of what we have on the ground than I am. We have two distinct cultural realities. These distinct cultural realities are going to have to find political expression. Having said that, there are what I consider to be a kind of left-wing version of why the two-state solution is dead and a right-wing version of why it's dead. The left-wing version says something like this: it's too late. Sure, there could have been a two-state solution, but you know, we kind of missed the shot at partition back in 1948. Then 67 came. This created a kind of tragic, mythologized series of actions by Israeli governments, particularly settlements. You got so many settlers on the ground today. You know, if you include Jerusalem, nearly 600,000. There's no way, as Marin Ben-Venisti said some years ago, the eggs can be unscrambled. You've got to assume that, you know, Israeli actions have obviated a two-state solution. And then you have sort of a right-wing version of that, which is the space is so small, we can't have missiles at Ben Gurion Airport. The region is dangerous. You can never really let go of the tiger's tail. Any withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza, or you know, any diminishing of the siege of Gaza, eventually will lead to a political vacuum, which will create a terrible threat to Israel's future. So what we have to do is acknowledge that the occupation as it currently stands has created a reality we have to continue with. And eventually the Palestinians will understand that their state, if they want one, has already started across the river in Jordan. Most of the Palestinian intelligentsia will go to Jordan. And after they do, you know, whoever is left behind in the West Bank and Gaza will find a way to reside in the territory without sovereignty. The fact is that both sides are making good points. It's almost impossible to imagine that the settlements will be uprooted. I'm not just talking about the sort of big settlement blocks, even those areas where Israelis now are living across the Green Line. In the smaller, more dispersed settlements like Kiryat Arba or Kadum or Tapuach and so on, there are a lot of them, and they're fierce, and they don't want to move. And an Israeli government would be very, very hard-pressed to try to uproot them. Ariel and so on, 15, 20,000 people. Very hard to imagine uprooting those settlers. At the same time, this is a very small space. We are living in a space north of Beersheba, which is roughly the size of greater Los Angeles. Those of you who've read what I've said in the past probably have seen me allude to greater Los Angeles more times than you probably want to remember. But the truth is, it's a very small space, and we do share a common urban infrastructure. It's almost impossible to imagine a situation where Israel will withdraw from those territories and say something like what we might have said in 1948, which is, well, we'll give them a state and maybe they'll leave us alone. I mean, that you know, we can't have the kind of partition that might have been entertained in 1948 when you basically had 1 million people on each side of the line, and they were fighting over, control of the hilltops so that they could farm in the valleys. That kind of state no longer exists. We're 12, 13 million people living in 10,000 square miles. This is not going to be an opportunity for dissociation or separation. And from a security point of view, we also live in a time which Nissim Taleb in his book, The Black Swan, calls fragility. We live in a time of fragility. Very small and very powerful actors can destroy networks of interconnected people with very great destructive force. You can't really avoid missiles at Ben Gurion Airport, and this could be a disaster for Israel if there isn't a common security regime. So, the real question is not how do we get to a one-state solution, because there is no one-state solution. There is only continuing occupation, which could well lead to Bosnia here. That's the more probable outcome than, a state with Khalil Shikaki and Bernard Avishai. What's much more, as I say, what's much more likely is a kind of Bosnia. So the real question is how a two-state solution that takes into account what people are saying about the flaws and even anachronistic thinking that has been poured into the two-state solution in the past. How do you create a two-state solution which takes into account both the settlements and the proximity and the security dangers? And here is where I think we need a little sort of what Gorbachev called perestroika. We need a little new thinking, because it's not really that hard to imagine how to solve the problem, but you have to sort of break the paradigm a little bit. And by that I mean you have to get away from the notion of separation and get to some paradigm of highly evolved cooperation. I hesitate to use the word confederation because it sounds much too Canadian and vanguard for this region. It seems to imply, that people get together because they like each other, which of course is not at all how confederations happen. Not in Canada, not in Europe, nowhere do confederations ever happen because people particularly like each other. They happen because of conditions that we have on the ground right now in Israel-Palestine, namely two distinct peoples who want to maintain cultural separation and yet share the things that need to be shared because of the tremendous forces pressuring them in this direction. But when I say highly evolved cooperation, I want to come back to this notion of a common urban infrastructure. You have in Israel-Palestine, in this small space, two peoples with what I would call not sovereign power, but let's call it sovereign negotiating rights. You have a Palestinian Authority, which for better or for worse has political legitimacy. It's a waning political legitimacy, and I'm prepared to speak about that in question and answer. But you have a Palestine Authority with political legitimacy. You have an Israeli government. They have the sovereign capability of negotiating for two states. But as soon as they get close to actually executing on some kind of two-state idea, they're going to find, as Olmert and Abbas found, that it's impossible to actually execute on the idea without introducing all kinds of transnational or confederal institutions to make two states work. The most obvious case is Jerusalem. Abbas and Olmert came to the inevitable conclusion that in order for the Jerusalem reality to accommodate two states, you have to have two sovereign capitals in Jerusalem, one for Palestine, one for Israel. You have to have a shared system for the Holy Basin, for the Old City, Mount of Olives, and so on, and a single municipal government. So, two states, two capitals, one municipal government, and internationalization of the Old City. What is the institution called a single municipal government for Jerusalem, which is not a confederal institution? What is a international custodian for the Old City, which is not a confederal institution? You can extrapolate from that to all kinds of other things. A common urban infrastructure, a single business ecosystem, which we have among the 12 million people we're talking about here. So what jurisdictions can either side exercise that we normally think of as jurisdictions for various states? What jurisdictions can either side exercise without tremendous cooperation on the part of the other? Water, they're both drilling into the same water table. They're both managing the same sewage system. Disease control, you get Ebola, God forbid, in Tel Aviv airport. It will affect everyone within 100 miles. The distance from Ramallah to Ramallah to Jerusalem is, like 8 miles. It's it's a 10-minute drive with traffic. The distance from Nablus to Herzliya, the two sort of commercial centers of the West Bank, and Israel, respectively, is 22 miles. That kind of drive makes the idea that you can sort of separate these businesses, the world of these countries into two separate business ecosystems is ridiculous. Think about the jurisdictions regarding bandwidth. The most important infrastructural reality in Palestine for its future is a 3G network, a network for entrepreneurs. There's no possible way you can have the introduction of shared bandwidth without a single entity that is distributing bandwidth for cellular technology. And you can go on. Tourism, the most important first bump that either economy is going to get from a peace deal will be from tourism. But tourists are going to move from Nablus to Herzliya, from one part of Jerusalem to Ramallah, in a seamless way. Well, how do you have a common financial system which allows the banks to have correspondent banks in Palestine having correspondent banks in Israel, and so on? So each can park its currencies and trade its currencies back and forth so that tourists don't have to get stuck. There are so many such issues that will need to be resolved through highly cooperative relations. And I haven't even begun to talk yet about security.
So I think, Bernard, a lot of what I'm hearing is that two states is certainly, it's kind of the only option, but by the same token, there needs to be a degree of creativity and new ideas flowing from the idea of a happy separation in order to achieve a workable solution, rather than just sticking up a wall saying, this is mine, this is yours, and we're done. And so I wanted to ask you, based on that, is what the forces were inside Israel, the pushing and pulling forces between pushing the government towards this kind of solution, these creative ideas, forcing these or pushing towards these negotiations that you're talking about, and on the other side, bringing them away, and what the imperatives are for the political camps there. And so that's one kind of set of push and pull force that I'm after your thoughts on. And the second is about, and a couple of people have asked about this question, is the role that Arab Israelis play in that conversation. And the two issues are, I guess, what kind of shift in the relationship between Jewish and Palestinian Israelis must occur in order for more traction to be had. And on the flip side, what like Labour and Livni have come together in order to form the Zionist camp, which has become the moderate centre-left bloc. And because of how does calling it the Zionist camp impact on the need for inclusion of Palestinian Israelis in that solution? So push and pull within Jewish society particularly, and the role of Palestinian Israelis in any solution.
Okay, well, obviously the question that you're suggesting, I'm begging, is, what possibility is there within the Israeli political system for generating people who will advance ideas like this? The reason why I dwelled on this is because I don't really see a two-state solution being worked out in advance, internally generated by some political constituency. What I do see is international pressure mounting on Israelis and Palestinians both in order to come to some kind of agreement into a negotiation which each side is negotiating in good faith. The logic that I'm expressing now will actually be possible and will, in some sense, trump the objections raised to a two-state solution in the last couple of years on both the left and the right. I don't really see Israelis needing to come up with these ideas internally in their own debate right now. What they do have to come up with is good faith negotiators, which we have not had, in fact. In the last 5 years, really since Olmert left office, there has not been an Israeli negotiator who has negotiated for a two-state solution in good faith. I suspect most people on this call will not need a lot of convincing along those lines. I'm not going to dwell on it unless somebody wants me to. The real question, therefore, is what chance is there for a government coming to power in Israel which will not be an obstacle to a good faith negotiation mediated by either Americans or required by, pressured by European Union diplomacy and so forth. My feeling is that there is an opportunity, there is a possibility. I can do the arithmetic. I'm sure most people on the call have done the arithmetic. But I guess my larger point is, if we assume that a Herzog-Livni camp comes to power, what will really happen is not that they will generate themselves these new ideas, but that they will no longer serve as an obstacle to the kind of negotiation which will be invited by American and European pressure. And that once that negotiation gets going, and if there is no obstacle, all of the ideas I've been talking about become very compelling, along with, by the way, a kind of re-engagement with the Arab Peace Initiative, which will allow for this cooperative confederal opportunity evolving in regional terms as well. The Jordanians are going to be extremely important in providing an economic basis for a Palestinian state. The Jordanian Palestinian bourgeoisie is richer, smarter, more connected to the Gulf than any other part of the Palestinian community, and will be absolutely essential for creating an investment climate and an entrepreneurial buzz in Palestine once a Palestinian state is formed, and something like a confederation between Jordan and Palestine, an economic confederation, will be inevitable. That would be, by the way, a very important source of intellectual capital for Israelis. Israelis will be sharing with Palestinians in this business ecosystem a tremendous amount of know-how, but the Palestinians will be sharing with Israelis a lot of know-about. And for Israeli entrepreneurs, the opportunity to work through Palestinians to a regional market will be fabulous. Again, a logic that emerges once the thing happens. You speak about Israeli Arabs. In this context, Israeli Arabs become very much a part of this potential meeting of these two business hubs, because the thing that we really can't forget is that this is a knowledge economy for the most part. We're talking about 12 million people whose future is to be networked into global economic realities. I mean, the one graph you have to kind of keep in front of your head at all times when you talk about the economic future of Israel and Palestine is that if you take the Standard & Poor's 500 largest corporation, or you could take the Global 1000 corporations, in 1975, about 83% of the market cap of such companies were tangible assets, about 13% were intangible assets. Now it's completely reversed. Now it's completely reversed. 83% of the market cap of Global 1000 corporations is intangible assets. It's know-how, it's science, it's know-about, it's marketing, it's building relationships and technology. And this is a great opportunity for Israel. This is the world in which Startup Nation happened. But it's also tremendously dangerous for Israel because you can't piss off the world's intelligentsia and expect that it's not going to dim your economic light. So there's a role for Israeli Arabs in that context. Israeli companies that want to move into the Gulf have a ready population of people who speak both Hebrew and Arabic and English, and who are eager to break out of the kind of constraints of living in a kind of narrowly defined Jewish state to a much more spaciously defined Jewish state, and could be integral to this solution. But the flip of that is also that those same Arabs who are sort of caught in this world of Netanyahu and this world of political forces that have been acting as an obstacle to a two-state solution, those Arabs are becoming increasingly angry, increasingly alienated. It's what often happens is the the people who have the greatest opportunity to assimilate into your society are the ones who get most furious when they're marginalized in your society. And Israeli Arabs are increasingly, forget, Israeli Arabs are 3 generations born in this Hebrew-speaking world already. Israeli Arabs have become much more assimilated into the Israeli reality than the vast majority of American Jews who get on planes and come and get citizenship. So there's something that I think we should regard as an opportunity here. And in my view, the two-state solution in its execution inevitably draws Israeli Arabs into this fabulous opportunity. The two-state solution, when tamped down by a kind of Netanyahu-Bennett world, necessarily drives Israeli Arabs into an extremely defensive and angry posture. My hope is that in this election that will translate into a large electoral turnout, a large turnout of Israeli Arabs for the vote, because there's no way the Herzog-Livni camp can actually get to 61 without a big block of Arab members of Knesset who are prepared to support it.
So this is a perfect way to segue into a question from Anne, which is on the likelihood of the inclusion of a Hadash Arab bloc joining with the Zionist camp in Yesh Atid and Meretz, and she asks even perhaps Shas, and whether there is actually any possibility of that occurring in a way that has never happened with the kind of exception of Rabin's time. And so that's an interesting to think about as well.
It's unlikely that Herzog and Livni will invite this new Arab bloc into the government as a coalition partner. It's inevitable, absolutely inevitable, that the Herzog-Livni bloc will negotiate with this camp for a vote of confidence if it is in a position to create a coalition of its own. There's no way Livni and Herzog can get to 61 without 12 to 15 Arab seats. I think what's most likely is Herzog and Livni will appoint a very highly respected Arab official, Arab judge, Arab economist, Arab professor or doctor or something to a ministerial post in order to make clear that even though they are not coalition partners with this particular bloc of Arabs, they nevertheless wish to gesture towards the inclusion of the Arab minority into Israeli civil society. I think that's a more likely scenario.
But will they require, in order for presumably Bougie Herzog to go to the president, to Ruby Rivlin, and say, I have the votes I require in order to be prime minister, he'll need to include those 12 to 15 votes in his calculation of 61, or he can go and say, I can be the prime minister with this guarantee of a vote of approval of a vote of confidence in the Knesset. Is that sufficient in order to convince Ruby Rivlin to appoint Bougie Herzog as prime minister?
I'm not sure I see the difference. I mean, Herzog and Livni will have to have a commitment on the part of the Arab members of Knesset that they will support the so-called Zionist camp. I mean,
yeah. It may just not include an element of the of a coalition agreement in the way that perhaps Lapid signed one with Netanyahu. Okay, I apologize. I think that we've lost Bernard temporarily. I am hoping that he will that he will exit and return momentarily. I apologize for this. Unfortunately, it's a hazard of doing these things online. We've now lost him. I'm hoping that he will return in a minute. Thank you to everyone who has been asking questions. I think we've got to quite a number of them so far. We've got about 20 questions so far, and I hope that they will keep coming. I think Bernard's done a very interesting job so far. Particularly, I found interesting the way that he's spoken about the inclusion of Palestinian Israelis into wider society will be very much enhanced and encouraged as a result of Israelis having economic access to the Gulf states. I think that's a perspective that I haven't heard before, and one that is very encouraging, because Palestinian society is one of the most impoverished and excluded and marginalized in Israeli society, and it's understandably difficult for Palestinian Israelis to be part of, or to feel part of, wider society, especially when the largest, like I said, moderate to left camp is known as the Zionist camp, and also when the symbols and language of the state are so Jewish. And as much as they are loyal members of the state, subscription to Zionist values is certainly something that's very difficult for Palestinian citizens of Israel. So hopefully that kind of arrangement will encourage their inclusion and enable them to be more fuller parts of Israeli society. I'm hoping Bernard's still not able to join us back, but I hope that he will be only another minute or so away. Like I said, I'd very much hope that you'll keep asking questions. We have a couple of interesting ones which I might foreshadow before Bernard re-arrives. One is the role that recent attacks by Hezbollah on Israeli forces in the north. There were a couple of IDF soldiers who were tragically killed only a few days ago, and the increase in hostilities has led reportedly to an increase in votes and in votes for Likud and for Benjamin Netanyahu, which is something that that he will obviously find encouraging. And so therefore one of the questions to consider is the role that Likud will be able to play on these security concerns in the lead up to the election. One allegation was that even these security concerns were generated in order to bump up these poll results. And so the question is what the Zionist camp, what Bougie Herzog and Tzipi Livni can do in order to I guess, reclaim the national security perspective. One thing NIF is doing in that is we are encouraging a more open and moderate security discussion through the Council for Peace and Security, which is a new strategic grantee of the New Israel Fund. There's more information on our website, of a number of new strategic grants that the New Israel Fund has made. And in particular, this idea that we can reinforce and create a more moderate security discussion in order to show that being pro-peace does not mean being poor on security. And certainly the Council for Peace and Security, which is made up of a number of very senior former members of the defence establishment, and that's been added to in recent times by films like The Gatekeepers, that these types of initiatives are able to further enhance the role that moderate security voices are able to play in the conversation. We've been joined once again by Bernard. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if we had some technical difficulties. I was just vamping quickly, but can you hear us there? Can you hear me, Bernard?
I think I'm back.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
Wonderful. I was just vamping quickly, but I hope that you'll be able to reflect, and we can jump forward without skipping too much, about the role of the recent Hezbollah attacks in the north on IDF, on the IDF, and that the reported increase in poll numbers for Likud based on perhaps some of the fear generated by that, and whether we can expect that security concerns will be leveraged by the Likud and by Israel and by Habayit HaYehudi, by Naftali Bennett, in order to gain greater traction in the polls. The most recent poll from, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago showed that they had the most number of mandates of seats for the first time, really since the beginning of the election. So whether that's something we can expect to continue.
Right. Look, the Likud camp, Netanyahu camp, has its sort of solid 40 seats. The Herzog-Livni camp, along with center parties and Arabs, have somewhat more than 40 seats. The battle is over the center, the so-called center. People who in America you call kind of low information voters, or people who are younger, people who are more influenced by headlines, people who are more influenced by what's cool, what isn't cool, by personalities, by charisma, and so on, because parties don't mean very much anymore. The mean age in Israel is 30. Which means that people aren't so stuck in parties that reflect the particular grievances of their wave of immigration. Most people in the center are driven by fear. Politics is often a game of, spooking people. And the real question is not whether Netanyahu is going to gain ground by spooking people about the neighborhood. He's done that very successfully for many years and can always heat up the border one way or another. The real question is whether the Herzog-Livni world can spook those voters with a sort of spooking of their own. And what they've been trying to do is create the fear, the dread of international isolation leading to economic difficulty, economic stagnation. It's a completely plausible fear. And just as the neighborhood is a completely plausible fear. So what Herzog and Livni need to do is create a narrative in which they are the solution to the problem of international isolation. They are solution to the problem of economic inequality and economic stagnation, making the mitigation of inequality impossible. And they have to show that Netanyahu is somehow screwing up relations with Europe, screwing up relations with America. As far as relations with America are concerned, the sort of scandal over Bibi's speech in the Congress is starting to have a certain amount of blowback. As far as Europe is concerned, even Lieberman is already saying, look at Putin, he thought he'd be tough in the Ukraine, and now the Russian bonds are junk bonds. You can't pull out of these international global networks and be, as I said before, you can't piss off the world's intelligentsia and still have the kind of investment of intellectual capital that will allow your country to grow. So Herzog-Livni have a narrative, and it's a narrative that has to take shape. It has to get more strong. It has to get more clear. My fear is not that they don't have a rival dread to Bibi's dread. My fear is that they're going to try to sell that by a little like Mike Dukakis going around in a tank. That may be a little before your time. But,
maybe for my benefit, if perhaps not for others, maybe to explain the reference.
Well, Michael Dukakis was the 1988 Democratic nominee. There was a lot of fatigue after the Reagan administration. There was a lot of Republican fatigue in the American electorate regarding the so-called Reagan era. And Dukakis came out of the Democratic convention in the summer of 1988 with a 17-point lead in the polls. 17-point lead in the polls. But he wanted to prove that he was sort of more competent than Reagan. Not that he had an alternative vision, but he was more competent than Reagan. He wasn't going to go to sleep at 8 o'clock at night. And that, by the way, Reagan was tough in the world stage, and he was also going to be tough. So he got himself a tank to go around in, and he was photographed with a helmet and his head bobbing up. You know, Mike Dukakis from Massachusetts, sort of his head bobbing up in a tank. And the polls almost reversed overnight. You know, you cannot out Bibi. You can't, Tzipi Livni can't say, you know, trust me, I can kill more Palestinians than he can. You know, that's just not, you know, it's not exactly a great campaign. What you've got to do is provide an alternative vision, which includes in part a kind of way of stampeding these electors in the middle towards your narrative by giving a plausible fear for them to chew on. And they haven't done this yet. If you're going to have a revolution, you have to sort of kick through the rotting door. You can't, you know, it's not enough just to have a rotting door. You've got to kick through it. And I'm not certain that this campaign organization has its act together. I mean, I know some people who are working on the campaign, and they tell me there's a bit of push-pull between Herzog and Livni right now, that Livni is sort of trying to pander to the people that she fears are the ones that, you know, are going to leave unless she kind of tries to out Bibi. And I think that's going to be a big problem. So, you know, I still have hope. I've got, you know, given the value of the apartment I'm sitting on, I've got a third of my net worth riding on the election. But, you know, I think this is a winnable election, but not if you just try to mobilize kind of residual resentment for Bibi. You can't say it's us or him. It's not going to be enough.
Which in some ways is in contrast to one of the main narratives that that I've heard coming out, which is that anyone but Bibi. And that seems that the sole reason that you would vote for the Zionist camp is just because it's not Bibi. And I think Moshe Kahlon and his Kulanu party are certainly hoping that that will be their ticket to a high number of votes on election day.
Well, Kahlon has a different thing going for him. Kahlon is Mizrahi, and even though he's not making that sort of front and center, the Likud has always had this kind of Mizrahi wing. And it was a wing that got pushed aside a little bit by the deal with Lieberman. And a lot of the Mizrahi leadership of the Likud felt that they had been kind of overlooked, underestimated. And the voters thought, hey, I thought this was like our party. You know, I thought like these were our guys, and suddenly the Russians are coming. So I think that a lot of the Mizrahi voters will kind of gravitate to Kahlon because his message, his populist message of more economic inequality, lower consumer prices, breaking the monopolies and the sort of oligarchs, most of whom are Ashkenazi, by the way, you know, like break the power of the oligarchs. All that message resonates with the Mizrahi voters, particularly, who tend to be less well educated and less rich.
I'll add quickly as well that one of these, while you're away, one of these new grants and partnerships that NIF has started is with an organization called Kiach, which is a very large Mizrahi Sephardi organization in Israel. And one of NIF's goals is very much to include a new social democratic language within that camp, to understand that there are economic opportunities for them with perhaps some changes and some reforms to the system and a way to bring up some of the lower members of society. And that's a very strong partnership that we think can be very fruitful in order to encourage more progressive democratic policies by partnering with the Mizrahi Sephardi community. I want to, with only 9 minutes left, I think before we would end, if anyone else has other questions, they should feel free to ask. I want to pivot to two questions that are very much based back on the discussion we were having before about two states. A couple of people have asked about the role of settlers in any kind of post-agreement world, and one questioner has asked for you to comment on this proposition that settlers be given 12 months to move out of the occupied territories, after which they'll remain under the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority. And another asked very similarly, whether you see there's any possibility and what role Jews would play living under Palestinian sovereignty after an agreement's been made.
Look, it first of all, it depends on the settlers. There are some settlers who specifically went to the West Bank because they saw themselves as a vanguard for annexing the territory. There are other settlers, that's a sort of one side of the continuum. There are other settlers on the other side of the continuum who just went there because the housing was cheap. These are very different kinds of people. And the spectrum in between includes people who are kind of religious mystics and sort of simply want to feel that their foot touches the footfall of Abraham, or, there's, and for whom their life is so bubbled, in the settlement, the land, the army, the synagogue, and so on. It's that the idea that somehow they could become Palestinian citizens is absurd. Having said that, I think, again, we ought not to forget that the scale here is so small. When I talk about Kiryat Arba, I'm talking about basically a 40-minute drive from here, from where I'm sitting.
Kiryat Arba is a small settlement in Hebron, or just next to Hebron?
It's just next to Hebron. It's not a settlement. It's a little town by now. It's about 4,000 or 5,000 people. And they live in a world of their own. I mean, Hebron itself and Kiryat Arba are in tremendous tension. Some of those people obviously will have to be uprooted because they will, under any circumstances, become a security threat to not just the local Palestinians, but I mean, they will become terrorists. They will become sort of Israel's version of the OAS, and after the Algerian occupation ended. But I think for a vast majority of settlers who kind of go along the spectrum more to the religious mystics, people there for economic reasons, and so on, it's not that they would necessarily see themselves as Palestinian citizens, but they will exploit the proximity to Israel to live in a kind of ambiguous state where they're citizens of Israel, residents of Palestine, living in a security environment in which both Israel and Palestine jointly cooperate and police the wider area. I think that's much more realistic, even though it sounds like ideal. The fact is, it's much more realistic than pulling people out, because the vast majority of Israelis cannot be pulled out. You can't relocate 100,000 or 150,000 people. You can't expect that. And if it comes to groups of people who organize resistance, which will sort of spread like wildfire, and would include, by the way, Israelis from Jerusalem streaming down to these settlements to reinforce them in the event that the Israeli army will try to pull them out. If it comes to that kind of confrontation, it's clear that Israel can't pull them out. And the Palestinians have to kind of figure out a way of focusing on sovereignty in its cities and cooperating with the Israeli government about what happens in the countryside, in order to grow the Palestinian state out of the only place it can grow, which is from the cities. Israelis, on the other hand, I think, will have to come to terms with the fact that a certain number of Palestinian refugees will come back into the area of Israel. Whether it's 30,000 or 50,000 or something along those lines, it'll be just a token with respect to the entire number of Palestinians who became refugees in 48 and their descendants. But the Israelis are going to have to come to terms that they too will have residents who are Palestinian citizens. The reason why I'm sort of hopeful about this comes back to the word cities. I mean, most of us travel between cities and really don't give a damn who's farming the land between the cities. When I think about the West Bank, it's so clear that Ramallah, in the event of a peace, Ramallah, Jerusalem, Hebron, will constitute a kind of triangular, will subtend a kind of triangle, a geographic triangle, that will become a city as big as Amman, Jordan. It'll be an Arabic-speaking city, which will be a counterpart to the megalopolis of Hebrew-speaking civil society in Gush Dan, in Tel Aviv and its environs. When that happens, as that city takes shape, I mean, who really cares who's farming? And who really cares if there's tapuach out there? I mean, they're going to become a kind of ectopic pregnancy. They're not going to have an Israeli hinterland feeding them. A lot of them will just come back into Israeli cities because their dream will have been shattered, but many of them will just stay. And they don't have to be pulled out as long as the Palestinians are willing to cooperate with Israel on security, so that there's a kind of joint policing of the entire area. And Palestinians know that, okay, some settlers remain, but then they get some of their refugees back. And there's a kind of reciprocal understanding that, you can have people living as residents without citizenship on both sides of the border. If an Arab refugee from the Valley of Jezreel, who lost territory in 48, if that family, and I know such people in Amman, I know such people who've lost territory in the Valley of Jezreel, if they get back some of that land and go live there, they're a 10-minute drive from Jenin. 10 minutes, takes longer to get from Melbourne to, St. Kilda? So the idea that residency without citizenship is impossible is kind of dumb. Of course it's possible.
Well, I think
it just requires a little creativity.
Well, I think that's something that we all look forward to seeing in the next couple of months, particularly as the Israelis begin to explore all kinds of social and political and security issues that are facing them in the lead up to the election. And so I think we'll leave it there. So thank you very, very much, Bernard, for your time tonight. Really, really appreciate it. I think there's been some really interesting insight into the creativity of reaching a two-state solution in a way that preserves the self-determination and the nationalistic ideas behind Israel and a future Palestinian state, while also ensuring that there is the kind of economic cooperation and security arrangements that will enable both to succeed and even thrive in a post-agreement era. So thank you very much again, Bernard. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight, especially while the tennis is going on. Thank you to everyone who asked a question, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to everyone's. I think in the end, we covered most of them. So thank you for your time. I wanted to add just a couple of last-minute things. We're hoping very much to have another event like this after the election, which is on the 17th of March. So I hope that you'll stay tuned and look out for that. We think it'll be, like I said, the next 6 weeks or so, and then on the night of election should be very, very interesting. So stay tuned on our Facebook page for updates about what's happening in the election, and also for this kind of event that we will have afterwards. We'll have details to come. I'd also like to say that putting on these kinds of events obviously takes resources, and we appreciate everyone who is able to make a donation tonight in order to enable us to continue to run these kind of events. If you are interested in giving, you can go to nif.org.au/donate. We really do appreciate your ability to support these kinds of events, as well as our work in Israel. I mentioned before our work with Kiach in order to encourage dialogue and social democratic values in the Mizrahi movement, and also with the Council for Peace and Security to create moderate voices on security. Another really exciting initiative that NIF's launching soon is an Israeli version of GetUp, an online organizing platform that crosses boundaries between all kinds of different sectors in Israel. You've seen, I'm sure, everyone who's on the call has had some kind of interaction with GetUp in Australia. I think it's a fantastic movement here, and I think replicating that in Israel will go a long way to breaking down barriers between sectors and enabling these social democratic values to come to the forefront through grassroots activism. Thank you very much again, everyone, for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Bernard, thank you very much again for your time tonight, and we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.